Today on the podcast, we answer a listener question on where they should save their money for a house down payment. But really, Jamie, we're getting to the heart of the issue here, and that's where do you save based on when do you need the money?
Welcome to the Military Money Manual Podcast, where every episode is all about achieving financial independence in the military faster than before. We believe personal finance shouldn't be boring or intimidating. Building wealth can be simple, and financial freedom is the ultimate financial goal. Now, here's your hosts, Spencer and Jamie.
Welcome back. This is Jamie, and I'm here with Spencer Reese from MilitaryMoneyManual.com. Today's episode, like Spencer said, we're going to be responding to a listener question about what to do with money for short-term savings goals. So I'll go ahead and read the question, and then we'll jump right into it. Spencer, I'm so thankful to have recently discovered this gem of a podcast. I've been in the Air Force for about 10 years. Thank you for writing a book tailored on financial advice specifically for members of the armed forces. Very excited to share with my colleagues at work. Question is, I sold my house about 2 years ago when I PCS'd and made a decent amount off of the sale. At first, I was considering buying it at my new duty station, but I've decided not to for at least a few years. He must have listened to some of our old episodes. It will depend on where we're stationed next. What would you suggest doing with that money? I've had it parked in a high yield savings account, HYSA, a no penalty CD, certificate of deposit, and invested in a brokerage account. I'm also currently maxing out my Roth IRA, and I'm close to maxing out my Roth TSP with CS&I fund combination. Thank you so much. Spencer, what do you think?
I mean, it sounds like they're doing a lot of the right things. They've got some of the money parked in a high yield savings account. They've also mentioned a no penalty CD. I think that's another great option to park cash. And then they've invested some of it in a brokerage account. And then just on like the broader picture, they don't mention any debt. That would be probably my next question, just to double check with them to see if they have any debt. But it says that they're currently maxing out their Roth IRA and close to maxing out their Roth TSP. So I'm going to assume that they've got their money house pretty much in order. They didn't mention if they were an officer or enlisted, but either way, you could be in a position where you're maxing out your Roth IRA and nearly maxing out your Roth TSP. Also, it sounds like they're doing their own asset allocation with the CS&I funds. That's fine. We're big fans of the life cycle funds here, but if they've got it dialed in and they've got an asset allocation that they're comfortable with, then that sounds really good. I like the fact that, that they didn't buy at their new duty station and that they're deciding to wait a little bit. We've got a couple episodes about not buying a house in active duty. And that's not to say that it's not right for the right person. Like there are scenarios where you can buy a house in active duty and it works out just fine. But if you're not 100% comfortable with it, then don't. You don't have to. You can rent. That's the beauty of renting, is it's very flexible and it's very easy to walk away when you do get those PCS orders to the next duty station.
As you mentioned the time frame of when do you need this money, and I think that's a really good way to frame the conversation. So let's start with money I need this month, stuff I'm going to spend. Where do I keep money like that?
So that's an easy one, Jamie. It's going to be in your checking account, also known as a current account or an on-call account in some countries. But in America, we usually just call that a checking account. And that's an account that you might have your ATM card, your debit card linked to. You might have your credit cards linked to it as your auto pay account, which we highly recommend setting up auto pay and automating as much as possible. That's where money that you need this month, I would say even in a couple months, you want to have it parked somewhere liquid, somewhere that you can get to very quickly. Maybe in a savings account. USAA makes it very easy to open up multiple savings accounts for multiple goals. So let's say that you've got a auto insurance payment and you make that every 6 months and it's $1,000, or let's say $1,200 so I could do easy math. All you'd have to do is when you get your paycheck, let's say you get paid on the 1st and 15th of every month, like most military service members do, well, just siphon off $100 of each paycheck into a savings account called auto insurance. And you could even have the auto payment set up for the auto insurance to a credit card, so then you're going to get some points, but you've set that money aside. And so when the 6-month mark comes and you owe the $1,200 auto insurance bill, you've already set aside that money automatically. You just pull it from your savings account, put it back in your checking account, and then pay your credit card off from there. So money that you need this month, money that you need next month, money that you'll need, I would say even 3 to 6 months from now, keep it in a checking account. It doesn't have to be your primary checking account. It could be a separate checking account. It could be a savings account as well. It could even be a high yield savings account, because a lot of times the transfer rates from like one bank to another are 2 to 3 days. It's not that long. But if you are expecting to withdraw the money to pay off, a bill, to withdraw, cash, or to pay off a credit card, you're going to want to keep that money in your checking account.
Yeah, nowadays high yield savings accounts are doing really well. Even as the inflation comes down and the Fed lowers the interest rates, you're still making maybe 4 or 3.5% soon on a HYSA compared to a USA checking account or savings account, which is going to make like 0.000002% basically. I don't know if I got enough zeros in there, but if I'm saving up 6 months for auto insurance bill, like you said, personally, I'm probably going to keep that in my checking account. But if I'm doing something like my emergency savings, that's definitely in a high yield savings account. And I think I could pay $20 for a wire transfer fee if I ever needed the money immediately, to where it's basically liquid, the same as it being in my checking account for me. And you can even get some money market accounts and things like that that pay interest and have check writing ability as well.
Yeah, that's true. So I would break it into, if I need the money this month or in the next couple of months, I'm going to keep it in my checking account. If I know I'm going to need it this year, I'm probably going to keep it in a savings account that's close to the bank that I bank with. But you could easily make the argument that, hey, if you don't need this money for a year, get it to work, put it into a savings account that's like a high yield savings account that's going to pay a much better interest rate than whatever your primary bank is. It gets a little bit more complicated after kind of that year mark. And this is kind of gets to the root of the person's question, where they're like, look, I've got, let's say it could be like 50,000, 100,000, even more. It could be $200,000 that they made off of their home sale. That's a lot of cash just to have sitting in cash, and know that every year inflation is chipping away the value of those dollars. And so what do you do? If you're thinking about, well, I want to get that money to work, you might think, I'll go for the highest earning asset, right? The asset class that has the greatest expected return. Then that might lead you to, okay, I'll put it into stocks. Well, be careful, because the reason that you have high returns in those asset classes is because you have high risk. That you can't disentangle the two, right? Like you can say, okay, the US stock market has on average 10% before inflation annual returns over the last 100 years. Yes, that's the average. But if you look at any individual year, you're almost never going to see a 10% return in that year. You might see like a 2022 year where it was down 20%. You might see a 2024 year where it looks like we're going to be up over 25%. It's very rare that you see anywhere kind of near that 10% average return. And for something like a house down payment, you don't really want to risk your capital. You don't want to set that money aside, and then in 3 years when you go to buy a home, you open up your savings account or your brokerage statement, and you're like, oh, let's say you invested in 1999 and you watch your money to go down in 2000, 2001, and 2002. That's 3 years in a row of a down market. That's tough. That would be tough to stomach.
Yeah, the 5-year window is a very common delineation between keeping it in cash or not invested and having it invested. I think you hear that a lot. You mentioned 3 to 5 years. There's no right or wrong answer here. And I think what the listener that sent in the question has was some in a high yield savings, some in a CD, and some invested is a reasonable conclusion that one might come to. There's options out there. I have some money in a Vanguard Cash Plus account. It's basically like a high yield savings account type account with Vanguard. It's a guaranteed rate until the Fed adjusts the rate, and then they change it a little bit. FDIC insured, I'm pretty sure.
It's actually I think 1.25 million FDIC insurance, because they use a sweep account. So they open up bank accounts at multiple partner banks. So you're FDIC insured over the $250,000 limit.
Nice. There's some options there. If you wanted to do, say you had $50,000 and you wanted to do 25,000 of it in high yield savings, 15,000 in a high yield, and 10,000 invested, like you could come to that conclusion reasonably with good logic. That might be the answer for you. That might not be the answer for everyone. It just depends on how much you actually need the cash and whether you could ride out the downturn if it turns down for 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years is actually a pretty long time, Jamie. Like at the start of a 3 to 5 year period, you might be like, oh yeah, we're going to buy a house at our next duty station. And so you put it into cash investments. And then you get to your next duty station. You're like, there's no way we're buying a house in this interest rate environment. So then it becomes a game of like, well, when are we going to use this cash? And maybe we do just put into our brokerage account and let it start growing and working towards our FI number. I would say if you think you're going to need the money in the next 3 to 5 years, I usually tend to shy away from any kind of stock investment or any kind of very risky investment. I'm going to go with something like a Vanguard Cash Plus account, like you mentioned, a money market fund. Vanguard has one, Fidelity has one, Schwab has their own. And a lot of times people are like, oh, the money market funds are paying so much more than the FDIC insured accounts. And it's like, really? Like, how much more? They're like 0.01%. And I'm like, that doesn't make a difference. Like, and a lot of times people get hung up on the fact that the money market funds aren't FDIC insured, but it would be a very, very rare scenario where you can't get your money out of a money market fund, as much money as you put into it with the interest that you've been paid. So again, you got high yield savings accounts. There's a lot of them out there. American Express has one, Marcus by Goldman Sachs, Ally Bank, CIT Bank, I think Citibank as well. You can Google it and you'll get at least a dozen options for high yield savings accounts. So don't take the ones I mentioned on here. They might not be the best offers at the current moment. Just go out there and do some research and you'll find a dozen banks that'll be happy to take your money and give you a nice interest rate for it.
I think the important thing with the 3 to 5 year window or less than 3 to 5 year window is that you're putting money aside as almost like an insurance policy. That money is still there when you need it and you're sacrificing on the potential growth or the investment. So if you were like, hey, I need this money for 10 months from now on January 1st of 2024, and you're watching the stock market currently up about 23% or so this year to date, you're probably at least thinking, man, that was a dumb choice. But it's not, because you don't know and you need that money and you don't know what November, December are going to hold. And there's a reason that the short-term answer is to preserve the capital when you need it. Now, if you don't need it and you have a very high income where you can restock a $50,000 savings in a couple months or something like that, that's a completely different situation. But that's not the average listener here, I don't think.
And two other options I just want to mention, Jamie. Like, let's say you've already got the money into your brokerage account and you're like, okay, is there like a ETF or somewhere where I can park it? And I'd like to say that there is. So there's two ETFs that I've been looking at recently that I've used in my Schwab account, because one downside about Schwab brokerage account is it doesn't have a good cash sweep program like Fidelity and Vanguard does. And so that basically at Vanguard and Fidelity, if you have any excess cash in your brokerage account, they put it into an account or into a money market fund that's earning, whatever the current best rate is, whereas Schwab doesn't do that. So you kind of have to do it manually. And two options I found for that is one is SGOV, that's SGOV, and that is an iShares ETF, 0 to 3 month treasury bonds. So basically they just every week they're buying treasury bonds that expire in 3 months and they're getting the best rate on that. They just trade like an ETF, so you can buy them at any time and you can sell them at any time and they settle within a day or two. And then the other fund is SCUS, and that's a Schwab ultra short income ETF. And again, that's a good way to put your money to work if you have it in a brokerage account and you want to buy an ETF. Very low expense ratios on both of those funds, and they pay a pretty healthy dividend every month. So that's a good way to get your money to work. And like, especially with the SGOV, you're investing in US Treasuries, so there's no risk of default. You're going to get your money back, which is fantastic.
Nice. I think where we both clearly agree, Spencer, is outside of 5 years. So if you know for sure you're not buying a house for 5 years, then that's something that we would both probably be looking at investing for our financial independence number. Depending on how soon you are ready to buy a house, outside 5 years, kind of the generally accepted term for investment. Again, there's still some risk there that it might not be there, or it might go down 50% and you might not be able to buy a house right when you wanted to. If you invest $100,000 and the stock market tanks 3 years in a row, are you really going to pull that money out and make a $50,000 down payment instead of $100,000 or waiting it out for a couple more years? But in general, over 5 years, you can probably go ahead and safely invest that money towards most of your long-term goals.
I'm putting that money to work in, let's say a Vanguard total stock market index fund or total international index fund, whatever, my asset allocation is. But if I start getting closer to the date where I'm like, okay, I want to buy a house in the next 3 years, let's say, or I know I'm going to buy a car in the next 2 years. If we had a good run up like we did this year in the US stock market, I might say, I'm going to sell a little bit of shares and move those over to cash. Or maybe I just won't contribute as much from my income to my investments, and I'll start building up my cash buffer so that when the time comes, I'm ready to make the purchase and I've got the cash available and I don't need to sell any of my assets.
I think people really tend to overthink what to do with their cash or their short-term goals. If you're doing a high yield savings account, great. Like if you're doing a CD, great. Don't worry about it. That's not a high impact decision, I don't think, for the average person. Put it somewhere, HYSA, money market, something, and just move on to the bigger, more impact decisions that are out there for your financial life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Jamie, people spend hours agonizing over, do I put it in a HYSA? Do I put it in a CD? Do I put it in a money market fund? And it's like you said, like in the long run, none of that's going to move the needle. So just pick something, put it there, move on with your life, go make more money, go save more money, go enjoy your life, get out of the spreadsheet. That's what moves the needle is when you just save yourself time. So just make a decision, right now, I think most of the high yield savings accounts are paying like between 4 and 5%. If you're somewhere in there, good, do it. Like you said, if you're at your local bank and it's paying 0.01% in your savings account, not a good place to park money for 3 to 5 years. But if you're in a high yield savings account, especially in most of the high yield savings accounts, they will update the interest rate that they pay you as the Fed increases rates. So if rates go up in the future, you're going to get a higher rate. If rates come down, you're going to get a lower rate. And so that's a good argument. Like if you have a specific date or you're not going to need that cash for the next 3 years, you could buy a certificate of deposit and you can lock in a rate. The only problem there is, what if rates go up? Now you're like, oh, I can get a better rate. And that's the advantage of like a no penalty CD. Or sometimes it's just worth paying the penalty, closing the CD, and then rolling it over to a higher rate.
Just a quick note from one of our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show. Don't know an IRA from a TSP or an SCRA from a CZTE? Fear not, the Military Money Manual, a practical guide to financial freedom, is here to help. In this concise, no-nonsense guide, our very own Spencer Reese, founder of the popular personal finance site, militarymoneymanual.com, offers invaluable tips and tricks to help service members of all ranks, branches, and bank account levels gain financial independence. Along with laying out the fundamentals of building wealth while serving, the book explains how to take maximum advantage of the unique financial perks available only to service members, whether active duty or reserve, officer, or enlisted. These benefits include special tax-deferred savings plans, preferential bank loans, fee waivers on high-end credit cards, and much, much more. Personal finance is not boring or intimidating. With its candid and accessible tone, this book feels like having a beer with a good and financial savvy friend. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, and learn how to make your military money work for you with the Military Money Manual, a practical guide to financial freedom by Spencer Reese.
The Military Money Manual is available on Amazon, Audible, and my website in hardcover, paperback, ebook, Kindle, and audiobook. Podcast listeners are eligible for a special discount by using promo code PODCAST when they purchase the Military Money Manual on shop.militarymoneymanual.com.
So let me devil's advocate a little bit here. Is it possible to have too much cash and to use kind of this model that we're talking about where, I might need it in 3 years. I might buy a house. Let me save everything up for a down payment. And next thing you know, you're sitting on a lot of cash or a high percentage of your net worth not getting put to work for you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people probably are pretty heavy on cash. I mean, Jimmy, we've coached some people before that have 6 figures in their checking account. Good for them. They know how to save. They just don't know how to invest, or they're not confident about their investing strategy. And so if we can help somebody who is in that situation, then yeah, you could, especially if you're like, well, what's this money for? And they're like, well, I don't know. I just know I'm supposed to save. And it's like, okay, well, let me introduce you to the concept of financial independence. Keep up that savings rate. And in 10 to 15 years, you're going to be a millionaire. You're going to be able to do whatever you want. So I think, yes, it can definitely swing the other way where people have way too much cash in their portfolio. However, that being said, we've enjoyed a pretty good bull market this year. In the future, there's going to be another bear market at some point, and anybody who has cash at that point is going to be feeling pretty smart and pretty good about their decisions. And you might be able to pick up some really good investments cheap.
Our good friend of the show, Eric Baskin, has mentioned that a lot of our people that he's worked with have too much cash, and we probably should have him on the show and do an episode about that, how to know when you have too much cash. Would be pretty good. I think there's a couple situations where you might want a lot of extra cash, approaching separation or retirement, maybe starting to grow your family. So one of the spouses is going to start making less money or something like that. But other than that, once you get your emergency fund set and you have your short-term goals, don't be afraid to put your cash to work. It's not the end of the world, but it will stunt your growth. I remember one time I was a young lieutenant and I saw a captain with $250,000 or so in his USA checking account. And I just happened to walk by one day. He was logged in at work and I was like, oh, wow. I wonder what that's like to have that much money. And now I'm like, oh, wow. I wonder why he wasn't putting that to work.
There's that stories of the guy who goes to the ATM and leaves his ATM receipt. And it's your checking account balance is, $400,000. And it's just dude, if you got $100 million invested, okay, fine. But otherwise, for us mere mortals, it's probably a little bit of overkill in your checking account. When I'm thinking about setting up my financial independence portfolio, the way I kind of think about it is I want 2 to 3 years of expenses in cash, and either in a CD ladder or in a high yield savings account. But that could be a lot of money, right? That could be a couple $100,000. For some people that's uncomfortable because they're I got to get that money to work. But for someone who's financially independent and let's say they're not working anymore, you're going to want to have that cash set aside in case the market takes a nosedive, and then you don't have to sell depreciated assets, right? So you can just draw down that cash that you've got saved up, and you can give the market time to recover. And then when it does, then you can sell off some stocks and then move that into your cash bucket. But a lot of times you'll hear financial advisors or people in the FIRE community talk about the bucket approach to retirement. And usually that first bucket is that 2 to 3 years of cash, either in a CD ladder or a high yield savings account. You can also throw in the Cash Plus account, money market fund, any of those ETFs we mentioned earlier. Then you have 2 to 3 years of expenses in bonds or in some other kind of low risk, but maybe a little bit higher growth asset class. Or maybe 3-year short-term treasuries. Vanguard has a great ETF set up called VGSH, which buys 3-year treasury bonds, and they just keep rolling over, and you just keep collecting the dividend off of it, and it's very low cost. And then the rest of your portfolio is invested in equities and bonds, kind of in accordance with your asset allocation, and that's kind of the growth portion of your portfolio. So you might end up having a very significant part of your portfolio in cash and bonds. And, to someone who's more risk attuned or is happy taking on risks, then you might be a little uncomfortable with that. And so maybe you need to dial it down. But that's kind of the consensus in the financial independence community, is that you want to have that cash bucket for your next couple of years, then maybe some other bond bucket, and then the rest of your growth portfolio.
So for this listener's question of, what should I do with the money? He's done some high yield savings, some CDs, and some investment. I think to summarize our response, the high yield savings or CD is fine. Probably not investing, depending on the time frame. Outside of 5 years is fine to invest, but inside of that 5 years is risky to put it into the stock market or put it into investment. So either one you do, high yield savings or CD, is fine. Don't be afraid to not invest money when you have a short-term goal to save for, but also don't be afraid to put your money to work when you're done with it. And it's also okay to change your goals. So let's say you thought you were going to buy a house and then you change your mind. Well, then put that money to work. It's okay for plans to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the strategy that he describes in the question, high yield savings account, no penalty CD, and invested in a brokerage account. Well, depending on how much, when you sold your house, let's say you had a $200,000 profit from it, and the next house you're looking at buying, maybe you only want to put $100,000 down. Well, you could put $50K into HYSA, $50K into a CD, and the other $100K, maybe that just goes into your brokerage account. And, it's still part of your portfolio. It's not like the money just completely disappears. It just potentially could be worth less when you need it in 3 to 5 years. But maybe that's okay. Maybe you factor that in because you're like, oh, I'm only going to need $100,000 and I've got that locked in. I've got that in cash. And then if this portion of my portfolio grows and let's say it doubles in the next 5 years and it's worth $200,000, well, maybe I put a little bit more down on a house, or maybe I get a bigger house. So you can kind of mix and match. And so, I guess my long answer there's really not much else you can do with the cash. I mean, like investing is actually very simple and boring. There's not that many options outside of public equities, public bonds, and then various cash investments. And, I see it on some of the forums and Reddit threads that I'm on sometimes when people are like trying to find different ways to invest their money. And it's like, dude, everybody wants a different way to invest their money. That's why you've seen this explosion of cryptocurrencies and options trading and all these crazy things in the last couple of years. People are just trying to make a buck as fast as they can, but that comes with a lot of risk. And there's a reason why we don't touch any of those investments. We don't even really talk about them very much on the show because they're not suitable for, I would say they're not suitable for almost all investors. But hey, if you want to gamble a little bit, that's okay with some of your money. But 90, 95, probably 99% or 100% of your funds should be the stuff that you actually need should be just in index funds.
We always enjoy getting questions like this from our readers like you that we can answer on the show or respond to via email sometimes or via Instagram DMs. You can DM us at Instagram. It's at Military Money Manual or on email podcast@militarymoneymanual.com. And if you got value out of today's episode or any of our other episodes, we'd appreciate a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to the show. We have over 300 5-star reviews on Spotify and over 100 5-star reviews on Apple. And we greatly appreciate that because it helps get the information out to other military families and spreading the good word about all that we're talking about here at the Military Money Manual podcast.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions presented here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. Reference to any commercial products or services does not constitute DoD endorsement of those products or services.